The screaming started at 0347 hours, approximately 6 minutes after Dr. David Chen had finally managed to fall asleep in his new quarters at New Haven Colony. By the time he'd thrown on clothes and stumbled outside, half the colony's emergency lights were flashing and armed security personnel were running toward the supply depot with the kind of urgency that suggested their perimeter had been compromised by something considerably more dangerous than local wildlife. "What's happening?" David asked Administrator Morrison, who was coordinating the response from the relative safety of the main compound's central plaza. "Kess," Morrison replied grimly, as if that single word explained everything. "She hit the medical supply warehouse. Third raid this month." David consulted his tablet, pulling up the colonial briefings he'd been given during his shuttle flight to Kepler, 438b. Kess. Thyrian female, approximately 25 in standard years, living wild in the Northern Territory. Morrison's expression carried the kind of frustration that came from dealing with an unsolvable problem. "She's been hitting our supply depots for 2 years now. Fast, smart, and absolutely vicious when cornered." Through the chaotic calm chatter from the security teams, David heard fragments that painted a disturbing picture: target mobile, heading for tree line, repeat, do not engage alone, casualties reported in Sector 7. "Casualties?" David asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the details. "She's killed 3 security personnel in the past year," Morrison said matter-of-factly. "Wounded a dozen others. Standard capture protocols have been completely ineffective." David watched the emergency response unfold with growing unease. The security teams moved with military precision, but there was something desperate about their coordination that suggested they were hunting something they didn't fully understand. "Administrator Morrison," David said carefully, "my briefing materials mentioned indigenous sentience on this planet, but the threat assessment classified them as manageable through standard diplomatic protocols." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Standard diplomatic protocols work when you're dealing with civilized beings who respond to reason. Kess is something else entirely. She's more animal than sentient, pure predator instinct with just enough intelligence to make her incredibly dangerous." A new voice crackled through the comm system: "Security Leader Johnson to base. Target has been located. Requesting authorization for lethal force." David felt his stomach clench as Morrison reached for his communicator. "Denied, Johnson. I want her alive if possible. The Xenobiology Department has been requesting a live specimen for study. Sir, with respect, attempted capture has resulted in significant personnel losses. This individual demonstrates extreme hostility to any approach." "Then find a better approach," Morrison snapped. "But I want options beyond body bags." The security operation continued for another hour, but it became increasingly clear that their quarry had vanished into the planet's dense forest with the ease of someone intimately familiar with the terrain. David found himself studying the tactical readouts with professional interest. The movement pattern suggested not mindless savagery, but strategic intelligence combined with superior knowledge of local geography. "Fascinating," he murmured, tracing the escape route on his tablet's terrain map. "Fascinating?" Morrison stared at him with obvious disbelief. Dr. Chen, that fascinating creature, just made off with 6 months' worth of medical supplies and emergency rations. "Yes, but look at what she took," David said, highlighting specific items on the inventory report. "Pain medications, antibiotics, surgical supplies, and high-calorie emergency food. Nothing valuable for trade purposes, nothing that couldn't be obtained elsewhere through less dangerous means." "Your point?" "She's not raiding for profit or random destruction. She's selecting specific items for specific purposes." David pulled up comparative data from the previous raids. "Look at the pattern: medical supplies always take priority, followed by food with extended shelf life. Never weapons, never technology, never trade goods." Morrison studied the data with reluctant interest. "You're suggesting she's not just randomly attacking our installations?" "I'm suggesting she's obtaining supplies for a specific need," David corrected. Someone who takes antibiotics and surgical supplies is dealing with medical issues. Someone who prioritizes high-calorie rations over luxury food is planning for extended periods without reliable food sources. Or she's stockpiling for a larger assault on the colony, Morrison said skeptically. Before David could respond, Security Leader Johnson's voice returned to the comm channel. Base, we have a problem. Target appears to have been wounded during the engagement. We're tracking blood trail heading northwest into the Razor Ridge territory. Morrison consulted his tactical map with obvious concern. That's completely outside our patrol range. If she's wounded and headed into that terrain, she'll either heal up and come back angrier, or she'll die from her injuries, Johnson finished. Either way, the problem might solve itself. David found himself disturbed by the casual way they discussed a sentient being's potential death. Administrator, what do you actually know about this individual beyond her raiding activities? No. She's a hostile indigenous who threatens colony security. What else do I need to know? Her background, her circumstances, why she's living alone instead of with others of her species. David scrolled through the cultural data in his botanical research files. Thyrians are typically social creatures. Solitary individuals usually indicate unusual circumstances. Dr. Chen, Morrison said with the patience of someone explaining basic facts to a child, your specialty is plant biology, not xenosociology. Leave the security assessments to people trained for that responsibility. But David couldn't shake the image of someone wounded and alone, seeking medical supplies through dangerous raids because they had no other options. As a scientist, he was trained to look beyond surface observations to underlying patterns, and the pattern here suggested something more complex than simple predatory behavior. The next morning, David requested access to the full security files on the Thyrian raids. What he found challenged every assumption the colony had made about their uninvited neighbor. The first recorded encounter was 18 months ago, he noted, reviewing incident reports. Thyrian female approached the colony's outer perimeter during a medical emergency. Colonist named Peterson had been injured in a construction accident. David pulled up Peterson's medical records and cross-referenced them with the security reports. According to the files, Kess had emerged from the forest carrying emergency medical supplies and had attempted to assist with Peterson's treatment before being driven off by security forces who assumed she was attacking the wounded man. She was trying to help, David murmured, the pieces of a different picture beginning to form. Every subsequent encounter followed a similar pattern. Kess appeared during emergencies or approached areas where colonists were in distress, only to be met with weapons fire and capture attempts. The raids had begun only after peaceful contact had been repeatedly rebuffed with violence. David spent the rest of the morning reviewing topographical data and biological surveys of the Razor Ridge territory. If Kess was wounded and heading into that region, she was facing serious survival challenges. The area was known for its dangerous wildlife, limited water sources, and terrain that could be treacherous even for someone in perfect health. Administrator Morrison, David said, arriving at the colonial offices with his tablet full of research data, I'd like to request permission to conduct botanical surveys in the Northern Territory. Morrison looked up from his administrative work with obvious suspicion. That's outside our established safe zones, Dr. Chen. And coincidentally in the same direction our hostile indigenous disappeared after yesterday's raid. Which makes it an ideal area for studying plant adaptations to low-security environments, David replied diplomatically. My research specifically focuses on how flora develops in areas with minimal human interference. Absolutely not. I won't authorize solo expeditions into territory where we've had hostile contact. Then I'll submit a formal research proposal through proper channels, David said politely. I'm sure the Colonial Research Council will be interested in comprehensive botanical data from previously unsurveyed regions. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, clearly recognizing the implicit threat of bureaucratic oversight if he denied legitimate scientific research without compelling justification. Fine. But you'll carry standard emergency communication equipment, check in every 4 hours, and return to base before dark. Any sign of hostile activity and you abort the mission immediately. Understood, David agreed, though he had no intention of aborting anything if he encountered someone in need of medical assistance. 3 hours later, David was hiking through the dense forest that separated New Haven Colony from the Razor Ridge territory, ostensibly collecting plant specimens while actually following the subtle trail markers that suggested someone had passed through recently. The blood trail security leader Johnson had mentioned was faint but detectable, leading steadily northwest toward the kind of terrain that would provide natural shelter for someone seeking to avoid pursuit. David found the cave entrance just as Kepler 438b's primary star was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The opening was partially concealed by dense vegetation, but the disturbed plant growth and traces of recent occupation were obvious to someone trained in biological observation. "Hello," he called softly, setting down his field pack at a respectful distance from the cave mouth. "I'm not with colony security. I'm a researcher, and I think you might need medical assistance." The silence that followed was complete, but David had the distinct sensation of being watched by someone who was evaluating him as a potential threat. "I'm going to leave some supplies here," he continued, unpacking basic medical materials and emergency food from his research kit. Antibiotics, pain medication, surgical foam for wound sealing. No weapons, no tracking devices, no attempts to capture or harm. David placed the supplies where they would be clearly visible, then retreated to a position about 20 meters from the cave entrance. "I'll be at this distance. If you want the supplies, you can take them. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. Your choice." For nearly an hour, nothing happened. David occupied himself with legitimate botanical surveys, cataloging the unique plant species that thrived in the reduced light conditions near the cave system. As the daylight began to fade, he prepared to return to base as promised, but a slight movement in the shadows near the cave entrance made him pause. The figure that emerged was nothing like the savage beast the colonists had described. Kess was tall and graceful, her pointed ears marking her Thyrian heritage, but David was struck immediately by the intelligence in her dark eyes and the calculated caution of her movements. She was wounded, the plasma burn on her left shoulder was obvious even from a distance, but she moved with the controlled precision of someone who remained dangerous despite her injuries. She studied David for several long moments, clearly trying to determine what kind of threat he represented. When she finally approached the medical supplies, it was with the fluid motion of a predator ready to strike or flee at the first sign of danger. "The antibiotics should be taken twice daily," David said quietly, not moving from his position. "The surgical foam will seal the wound, but you'll need to clean it thoroughly first to prevent infection." Kess froze at the sound of his voice, her head tilting slightly as if she was analyzing not just his words but his tone and intent. For a moment, David thought she might flee back into the cave with the supplies. Instead, she straightened to her full height, fixed him with a stare that seemed to look directly into his soul, and spoke in accented but clear standard, "Why?" The single word carried layers of meaning. Why help? Why risk approaching her territory? Why offer assistance when every other human had offered only violence? "Because you're hurt," David replied simply. "And because I think there's been a misunderstanding about your intentions toward the colony." Kess studied him for another long moment, then gathered the medical supplies and melted back into the shadows as silently as she had appeared. But as David began his return journey to New Haven Colony, he heard her voice one more time, barely audible in the evening air. "Humans should not return. Is dangerous." David smiled as he navigated the forest path back to civilization, recognizing the warning not as a threat, but as advice from someone who understood exactly how dangerous the territory could be for someone unprepared to defend themselves. "We'll see," he murmured to himself, already planning tomorrow's botanical survey expedition. David returned to the cave entrance the following afternoon with fresh medical supplies, more sophisticated wound care materials, and what he hoped was a better understanding of how to approach someone who had every reason to distrust human intentions. The supplies he'd left the previous day were gone, which he took as a positive sign that Kess was at least willing to accept help, even if she wasn't ready to trust the helper. I brought better antibiotics, he announced to the seemingly empty forest, setting his pack down in the same location as before. The plasma burns can develop resistant infections if they're not treated properly. This time, he didn't retreat to his previous observation position. Instead, he settled cross-legged on the ground about 10 meters from the cave mouth and began his routine botanical documentation, speaking in quiet, conversational tones as he worked. The plant adaptations in this area are remarkable, he said, recording data about a vine species that seemed to thrive in the mineral-rich soil near the cave system. This particular variety has developed symbiotic relationships with at least 3 different soil organisms that shouldn't be able to coexist in the same ecosystem. From his peripheral vision, David caught subtle movements in the shadows near the cave entrance. Kess was listening, though she remained hidden. The colonists think of this region as hostile territory, David continued, carefully photographing the vine's unusual root structure, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated biological communities I've ever encountered. Everything here has adapted to work together rather than just competing for resources. A soft sound, barely more than a shifted pebble, suggested that his audience was becoming more attentive. The colony's agricultural specialists could learn a lot from systems like this, David said, genuinely enthusiastic about his discoveries. Instead of fighting the natural ecosystem, we could design farming methods that complement existing biological relationships. Humans do not learn, came Kess's voice from the shadows, carrying bitter experience. Humans take. David looked up from his plant samples, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. Some do, he admitted. But not all. Some of us prefer understanding to taking. Kess emerged partially from the cave entrance, staying well within reach of cover but allowing herself to be clearly visible. David could see that his medical supplies had been effective, the plasma burn on her shoulder was properly sealed and showed signs of healing. But he also noticed other injuries. Older scars, healed breaks in what had once been elegant features, and a wariness in her posture that spoke of too many violent encounters. You study plants that do not fight, she said, gesturing toward his botanical samples. Why? Because cooperation usually works better than conflict, David replied, returning to his documentation but keeping his voice conversational. Plants that work together create stronger ecosystems than plants that just compete with each other. Humans compete, Kess observed. Always take more territory, more resources. Never enough. The colonists compete, David corrected gently. But not all humans think that way. Some of us believe there's enough for everyone if we're smart about sharing. Kess moved closer, still maintaining careful distance but showing increased interest in his work. You share medicine with enemy. You're not my enemy, David said, meeting her gaze directly. You're someone who needed help, and helping people is more important than following colonial policies. Colonial policies say capture Thyrian for study, Kess said with dark humor. Like plant sample. David felt anger flash through him at the casual way she described being treated as a specimen rather than a person. I'm not interested in capturing anyone for study. I'm interested in understanding how ecosystems work, including the people who are part of them. People. Kessa's pointed ears perked with surprise. Humans call Thyrians indigents or hostiles. Not people. Then humans are making a mistake about what words mean, David replied firmly. You think, you feel, you make decisions about how to live your life. That makes you a person, regardless of what species you are. Kess studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating whether his words matched his intentions. After a long moment, she moved closer still, settling into a position where she could observe his work while maintaining escape routes. Show botanical study, she said, curiosity apparently overriding caution. David spent the next hour. David returned to the cave entrance the following afternoon with fresh medical supplies, more sophisticated wound care materials, and what he hoped was a better understanding of how to approach someone who had every reason to distrust human intentions. The supplies he'd left the previous day were gone, which he took as a positive sign that Kess was at least willing to accept help, even if she wasn't ready to trust the helper. I brought better antibiotics, he announced to the seemingly empty forest, setting his pack down in the same location as before. The plasma burns can develop resistant infections if they're not treated properly. This time, he didn't retreat to his previous observation position. Instead, he settled cross-legged on the ground about 10 meters from the cave mouth and began his routine botanical documentation, speaking in quiet, conversational tones as he worked. The plant adaptations in this area are remarkable, he said, recording data about a vine species that seemed to thrive in the mineral-rich soil near the cave system. This particular variety has developed symbiotic relationships with at least 3 different soil organisms that shouldn't be able to coexist in the same ecosystem. From his peripheral vision, David caught subtle movements in the shadows near the cave entrance. Kess was listening, though she remained hidden. The colonists think of this region as hostile territory, David continued, carefully photographing the vine's unusual root structure, but it's actually one of the most sophisticated biological communities I've ever encountered. Everything here has adapted to work together rather than just competing for resources. A soft sound, barely more than a shifted pebble, suggested that his audience was becoming more attentive. The colony's agricultural specialists could learn a lot from systems like this, David said, genuinely enthusiastic about his discoveries. Instead of fighting the natural ecosystem, we could design farming methods that complement existing biological relationships. Humans do not learn, came Kess's voice from the shadows, carrying bitter experience. Humans take. David looked up from his plant samples, careful not to make any sudden movements that might be interpreted as threatening. Some do, he admitted. But not all. Some of us prefer understanding to taking. Kess emerged partially from the cave entrance, staying well within reach of cover but allowing herself to be clearly visible. David could see that his medical supplies had been effective, the plasma burn on her shoulder was properly sealed and showed signs of healing. But he also noticed other injuries. Older scars, healed breaks in what had once been elegant features, and a wariness in her posture that spoke of too many violent encounters. You study plants that do not fight, she said, gesturing toward his botanical samples. Why? Because cooperation usually works better than conflict, David replied, returning to his documentation but keeping his voice conversational. Plants that work together create stronger ecosystems than plants that just compete with each other. Humans compete, Kess observed. Always take more territory, more resources. Never enough. The colonists compete, David corrected gently. But not all humans think that way. Some of us believe there's enough for everyone if we're smart about sharing. Kess moved closer, still maintaining careful distance but showing increased interest in his work. You share medicine with enemy. You're not my enemy, David said, meeting her gaze directly. You're someone who needed help, and helping people is more important than following colonial policies. Colonial policies say capture Thyrian for study, Kess said with dark humor. Like plant sample. David felt anger flash through him at the casual way she described being treated as a specimen rather than a person. I'm not interested in capturing anyone for study. I'm interested in understanding how ecosystems work, including the people who are part of them. People? Kessa's pointed ears perked with surprise. Humans call Thyrians indigens or hostiles. Not people. Then humans are making a mistake about what words mean, David replied firmly. You think, you feel, you make decisions about how to live your life. That makes you a person, regardless of what species you are. Kess studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating whether his words matched his intentions. After a long moment, she moved closer still, settling into a position where she could observe his work while maintaining escape routes. Show botanical study, she said, curiosity apparently overriding caution. David spent the next hour explaining his research methods, describing how he documented plant relationships and analyzed ecosystem interactions. Kess proved to be a remarkably attentive student, asking questions that demonstrated not just intelligence but deep familiarity with the forest environment. This vine, she said, pointing to the species David had been documenting, grows only near mineral springs. Feeds metals to soil organisms that protect tree roots from acid groundwater. How do you know that? David asked, genuinely impressed by her ecological knowledge. Live here long time. Watch how plants help each other survive. Kess's expression carried a mix of pride and sadness. Know which partnerships work, which fail. You've been living alone in this territory. Alone safer than. For 2 weeks, David's afternoon botanical surveys became collaborative research sessions that revolutionized his understanding of Kepler 438b's ecosystem complexity. Kess proved to be not just knowledgeable but pedagogically gifted, explaining intricate biological relationships with the clarity of someone who had spent years observing and analyzing natural systems. This symbiosis, she explained, indicating a cluster of flowering plants that grew exclusively around certain tree species, creates chemical barriers against invasive organisms. Colony agriculture fails because humans plant single species without understanding protective partnerships. David documented her observations with growing excitement, recognizing breakthrough insights that could transform colonial farming practices. If we applied these principles to crop rotation and companion planting, we could reduce pest problems and increase yields without harmful chemical treatments. Yes, but humans must learn patience, Kess said with amusement. Natural partnerships take time to establish. Human agriculture wants quick results. Their research relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, though Kess maintained careful boundaries about personal information and never fully relaxed her awareness of potential threats. She had begun meeting David at various locations throughout her territory, showing him different ecological niches and explaining their unique characteristics. Tomorrow, show human David the water gardens, she said as they concluded another productive documentation session. Very important for understanding how forest maintains mineral balance. David packed his recording equipment with satisfaction, already anticipating the new discoveries awaiting him. Should I bring anything specific for the water garden surveys? Bring normal equipment. And maybe extra food, Kess added with what David had learned to recognize as subtle humor. Water gardens far from human territory. Long day of walking. As David prepared to return to the colony, an unusual sound made both of them freeze, the distant whine of approaching aircraft engines. Security patrol, Kess said, her relaxed demeanor instantly transforming into predatory alertness. Human David should leave quickly. Dangerous to be found in Thyrian territory. What about you? David asked, though he was already packing his equipment with practiced efficiency. Kess knows hiding places patrol cannot reach. Go now, before they scan for human biosignatures. David made it halfway back to the colony's safe zone before the security patrol intercepted him. The military transport settled to the ground with the aggressive roar of engines designed to intimidate, and security leader Johnson emerged with the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this conversation. Dar. Chen, Johnson said with false courtesy, interesting location for botanical research. Very close to hostile territory. The most interesting plant adaptations occur in marginal environments, David replied diplomatically, gesturing toward his specimen bags. Areas with minimal human interference often preserve unique ecological relationships. And those ecological relationships require daily expeditions to the same general area. Johnson consulted his tactical pad with obvious skepticism. My patrol logs show you've been conducting botanical surveys in this region for 2 weeks. Comprehensive ecosystem documentation requires extensive fieldwork, David said, maintaining his academic composure despite growing concern about where this interrogation was heading. Dr. Chen, let me be direct. We have reason to believe the hostile indigenous who has been raiding our supply depots is operating from somewhere in this territory. Your research expeditions coincide suspiciously with a complete cessation of hostile activity. David felt his heart rate increase as he realized the implications of Johnson's observation. Are you suggesting that my botanical research has somehow affected indigenous behavior patterns? I'm suggesting that your botanical research has been providing intelligence to someone who knows how to avoid our patrols. Johnson's voice carried the edge of someone prepared to make accusations. Either you're monumentally unlucky in your timing, or you're in contact with our hostile indigenous. Security Leader Johnson, David said carefully, my research focuses on plant biology, not indigenous sociology. If my presence in this area has coincidentally affected local behavioral patterns, it's not through any intentional communication. Johnson studied him with the analytical attention of someone trained to detect deception. Dar. Chen, are you currently in contact with the Thyrian individual known as Kess? The direct question left David with no room for evasion without outright lying to colonial security. I have encountered an individual who may match that description during my research activities. Encountered how? She observed my work from a distance. We had limited verbal interaction regarding ecosystem relationships. And you didn't report this contact to colonial security because the interaction was peaceful and related to my scientific research, David replied, hoping his explanation would satisfy administrative curiosity without triggering a manhunt. The individual demonstrated extensive knowledge of local ecology that was relevant to my botanical documentation. Johnson's expression shifted from suspicion to alarm. Dr. Chen, you've been conducting unauthorized contact with a hostile indigenous who has killed 3 colonial personnel. Do you understand the security implications of your actions? Before David could respond, his communicator crackled with emergency traffic from the colony's main base. All units, all units. We have reports of structural damage to the main water treatment facility. Possible sabotage. Security teams respond immediately. Johnson's attention shifted to the emergency call, but his gaze remained fixed on David. Dr. Chen, you're confined to base pending a full security debriefing. Consider yourself under investigation for unauthorized contact with hostile forces. The flight back to New Haven Colony was tense with unspoken accusations and growing concerns about the water treatment emergency. David found himself under escort to the colony's security offices while emergency responders dealt with what appeared to be significant damage to critical infrastructure. Dr. Chen, Administrator Morrison said as David was brought into the security briefing room, we have a problem. The water treatment facility has suffered catastrophic failure, and preliminary assessment suggests deliberate sabotage. David studied the damage reports with growing unease. The technical specifications showed precision destruction of key components, not random vandalism, but targeted strikes against systems that would cripple water purification without causing immediate danger to personnel. This is consistent with Kess's previous raiding patterns, Security Leader Johnson announced, consulting tactical analyses. Precise targeting of critical systems, minimal collateral damage, strategic timing to maximize operational disruption. Actually, David said, studying the damage patterns more closely, this doesn't match her previous methodology at all. Morrison and Johnson stared at him with obvious surprise. Explain, Morrison demanded. Kess's raids have always focused on obtaining specific supplies. Medical materials, emergency food, items needed for survival in wilderness conditions. This attack doesn't take anything, it just destroys infrastructure. You're suggesting someone else is responsible? Johnson asked skeptically. I'm suggesting the motivation and methodology are completely different from her established patterns, David replied. This looks more like systematic sabotage designed to force the colony to rely on external water sources. Before anyone could respond to his analysis, a new emergency alert sounded throughout the base. Colony personnel, we have confirmed reports of armed hostiles approaching from the eastern perimeter. This is not a drill. All civilians to emergency shelters immediately. Through the briefing room's windows, David could see colonists running toward designated safety areas while security teams deployed defensive positions. But what caught his attention was a lone figure moving with fluid grace along the forest edge. Kess, approaching the colony perimeter with obvious urgency. She's not attacking, David said suddenly, recognizing her body language patterns. She's trying to warn you about something. Dr. Chen, Johnson said grimly, preparing his sidearm, you're about to see exactly how peaceful your indigenous contact really is. Security Leader Johnson, wait, David began, but Johnson was already moving toward the defensive positions, leaving David under guard in the briefing room. Through the communication system, David heard the encounter unfold, security personnel taking positions, challenges being issued, and then Kess's voice, strained with urgency, calling out in accented standard. Humans listen. Water poisoned by others. Kess bring warning. The communication channel fell silent except for confused murmuring as colonial personnel tried to process what they'd heard. Then Security Leader Johnson's voice, tight with suspicion, identify these others. Explain how you know about water system damage. Eastern Territory invaders poison water sources to force colony dependence, Kess replied, her voice carrying across the compound. Traditional knowledge recognizes signs of systematic territorial conquest. Colony in danger from species that use resource control for domination. David felt the pieces of a larger conspiracy beginning to form. If Kess was right about external forces targeting the colony's infrastructure, then her supposed attacks had actually been attempts to prepare for a siege by stockpiling medical supplies and emergency food. Administrator Morrison, he called out to the colony leader, I need to speak with Kess directly. If she's been preparing for an attack on the colony, her intelligence could be vital for our defense. Morrison looked between the security displays showing Kess's position and the water treatment damage reports. Dar. Chen, are you suggesting that our hostile indigenous has actually been trying to protect us? I'm suggesting that our hostile indigenous may have been the only one who recognized what was really threatening the colony, David replied with growing certainty. And if that's true, we need her knowledge to survive what's coming. The colony's emergency council convened in record time, with David serving as translator between colonial leadership and Kess, who had agreed to enter the compound under guarantee of safe passage. Her presence in the briefing room created obvious tension among security personnel, but the urgency of the situation overrode normal protocols. The species you call Vorthak move through territory like slow predators, Kess explained, using David's botanical diagrams to illustrate her intelligence reports. First poison water sources, then destroy food production, then offer protection in exchange for territorial rights. Administrator Morrison studied the tactical maps with growing concern. How long have you known about this threat? 6 months. Observe unusual movement patterns in eastern ranges, Kess replied. Traditional knowledge teaches recognition of conquest behaviors across species. Kess prepare for siege by gathering medical supplies and emergency food. Security Leader Johnson looked up from his threat assessments with grudging respect. The raids weren't attacks on us. You were stockpiling supplies for our defense. Defense of territory includes all residents, Kess said simply. Colony humans part of ecosystem now. Ecosystem guardian protects all parts. David felt a surge of admiration for the strategic thinking that had been completely misunderstood by colonial security. Kess, what do you need from us to implement effective defensive measures? Need human technology combined with traditional knowledge of terrain advantages, she replied, moving to the tactical display with confident authority. Vorthak expect colonial resistance patterns. Will not expect forest-adapted tactics. Over the next 12 hours, David witnessed the remarkable transformation of New Haven Colony's defensive strategy as Kess's ecological expertise merged with human technological capabilities. Her understanding of natural camouflage, wildlife behavior, and terrain advantages revolutionized their approach to protecting critical infrastructure. Forest provides natural barriers here and here, she indicated on the tactical map, but only if humans understand how to work with ecosystem instead of against it. You're suggesting we use the natural environment as part of our defensive network, asked Chief Engineer Williams. Suggesting humans learn what Thyrian knowledge has known for generations, territory defends itself when residents understand proper partnership. Kess gestured toward areas on the map that colonial surveys had marked as impassable. These locations not impassable are protected by natural systems that respond to respectful approach. David found himself serving as cultural interpreter as much as linguistic translator, helping colonial personnel understand concepts that had no direct equivalent in human military doctrine. The idea of working with natural systems rather than imposing technological solutions required a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. The water treatment sabotage was designed to force us to rely on external sources, David explained as the defensive preparations continued. But Kess knows natural water purification methods that could maintain our independence. Traditional filtering systems use plant partnerships to remove toxins and maintain mineral balance, Kess added, pulling up botanical data from David's research files. Human technology enhanced with ecosystem knowledge creates superior results. The first Vorthack probe came at dawn, precisely as Kess had predicted based on their species' behavioral patterns. But instead of finding a vulnerable colony dependent on compromised infrastructure, they encountered a defense network that seemed to emerge from the forest itself. Perimeter sensors are detecting movement, but the targets keep disappearing from our tracking systems, reported Tactical Officer Reynolds. Not disappearing, Kess corrected from her position at the Integrated Command Station. Moving through natural corridors that mask electronic signatures. Traditional knowledge anticipates technology-dependent species. David watched with fascination as Kess coordinated defensive responses that combined human surveillance technology with her intimate knowledge of the forest ecosystem's natural patterns. Colonial personnel who had once seen her as a savage threat now followed her tactical guidance with growing respect. Kess, David said during a brief lull in the defensive action, how did you know that helping the colony was worth the risk? We weren't exactly welcoming when you first tried to establish contact. Ecosystem guardians do not choose who deserves protection based on whether protection is appreciated, she replied, monitoring sensor readouts with practiced efficiency. Responsibility to territory includes all residents, even ones who do not understand ecosystem relationships. The siege continued for 3 days, but the Vorthack assault forces found themselves facing an opponent they hadn't anticipated, a defense network that treated the forest as an ally rather than an obstacle. Every tactical move they made was anticipated, every technological advantage was countered by natural systems they didn't understand. Their commander is requesting communication, Security Leader Johnson announced as the third day's attacks were repelled with increasingly efficient coordination. Let them communicate, Administrator Morrison said with satisfaction. But they'll be communicating with a unified colonial Thyrian leadership. The Vorthack withdrawal came with grudging acknowledgement that New Haven Colony had achieved something unprecedented, successful integration of indigenous knowledge with colonial technology, creating a defensive capability that transcended what either approach could accomplish independently. In the aftermath of their victory, David found himself working with Kess to establish formal protocols for ongoing cooperation between colonial administration and traditional Thyrian ecological management. Their partnership had evolved from medical assistance to scientific collaboration to strategic alliance, demonstrating possibilities that neither had initially imagined. Administrator Morrison, David said during the post-crisis planning sessions, I'd like to recommend that Kess be appointed as the colony's chief environmental advisor, with full authority to guide sustainable development policies. And I'd like to recommend that Dr. Chen be appointed as our Indigenous Relations Coordinator, Morrison replied with a smile. It seems you two have developed an effective working relationship. More than working relationship, Kess said with what David was learning to recognize as her version of humor. Human David only person who tried to understand instead of capture. Partnership based on mutual respect rather than dominance. As they worked together to establish the new cooperative framework, David realized that their relationship had become something unique in both their cultures, a partnership that honored individual strengths while creating capabilities that neither could achieve alone. Kess, he said as they reviewed the ecological restoration proposals that would guide the colony's future development, I need to ask you something personal. Human David asked many personal questions. Is persistent trait. When you warned me that returning to your territory was dangerous, were you protecting me from external threats, or from yourself? Kess considered the question with the thoughtful attention she applied to complex ecological problems. First time, protecting from external threats. Forest has many dangers for unprepared humans. And later? Later, protecting from internal change, she admitted. Thyrian isolation safer than partnership with humans who might leave when cooperation becomes complicated. David felt warmth spread through his chest at her honest vulnerability. What if the human promised not to leave when cooperation became complicated? Then human would need to understand that partnership with ecosystem guardian includes commitment to protect territory and all residents, Kess replied seriously. Is lifetime responsibility, not temporary collaboration. I think, David said, reaching for her hand with the same careful respect he'd shown during their first encounter, that lifetime responsibility sounds exactly right. 3 months later, New Haven Colony had become the first successful example of integrated human-indigenous cooperation in the colonial expansion program. Their sustainable development model, based on ecological partnership rather than resource exploitation, was being studied by xenosociologists across human space. But for David and Kess, the larger implications were less important than the daily reality of working together as equal partners in protecting and nurturing the world they both called home. Their relationship had grown from cautious medical assistance to scientific collaboration to something deeper than either had expected, a bond based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that the best partnerships enhanced both individuals while creating something greater than either could achieve alone. Human David, Kess said as they concluded their evening review of the colony's ecological integration progress, traditional Thyrian bonding ceremony includes promise to guard each other's territory as carefully as personal safety. Human David, he replied with growing confidence, thinks traditional Thyrian bonding ceremony sounds like exactly the kind of commitment he wants to make. As they stood together on the observation deck overlooking the thriving colony that had learned to work with its natural environment rather than against it, David reflected on how a simple act of medical kindness had evolved into partnership, love, and proof that the most powerful relationships were built not on dominance but on recognition of each other's complete worth. Kess, he said, pulling her close as they watched the binary sunset paint the sky in colors that served no tactical purpose but somehow made everything else worthwhile, thank you for teaching me that understanding is always better than conquest. Thank you for proving that some humans know difference between partnership and possession, she replied, her pointed ears flicking with contentment as she settled against his shoulder. Is rare gift among colonial species. In the distance, the forest they protected together rustled with the sounds of healthy ecosystem relationships, partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, cooperation rather than competition, and the patient wisdom that recognized true strength came from working together rather than standing alone.